Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about a psychological phenomenon that I thought was interesting enough to talk about. So we're going to talk about something that I call the moral reversal, which is a phenomenon that occurs in the mind, and it's basically a way of thinking about how negative entities influence us and why we tend to go along with their influence. And that's in spite of spiritual drive, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we're going to talk about the concept of evil, or the philosophy of evil, which I'm sure this idea is probably somewhere in philosophy. Someone in the past sort of probably came up with the same idea. I haven't studied it, but like I said, philosophy is made up of a whole bunch of ideas that many people have discovered many times, right? I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with this idea, and I won't be the last. But to get into it, to go over this first point, which is a question, says, why do people go along with the negative suggestions planted into their subconscious by negative entities? So that's an interesting question, right? Because normally we like to think of ourselves as good people and we want good things. Why is it that a negative entity could just plant a suggestion and cause us to do very evil and terrible things? And we talked about how there's a grooming process to it, but still I want to look into it more from this perspective that I'm going to set up in a moment. So this should really be hard. It should be hard for a negative entity to get us to do negative things not only due to the fact that negative behaviors feel negative, but also due to spiritual drive, right? So our spiritual drive, right, is something that we have which helps us or causes us not only to seek God, but it causes us to have a desire, right, to behave like Jesus, right, to behave in the likeness of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate reflection of God's nature, or the truth of God. It is the highest expression of the truth of God in terms of behavior, or in terms of human behavior, right? How we would express our behavior in terms of our ability to choose, which is a very technical way of putting it. But if we have spiritual drive and that causes us to behave more like Jesus, how do these guys interrupt that, right? Shouldn't spiritual drive sort of cancel this out? Well, yes, but there's a reason why they still have the ability to do that, and it has to do ultimately with the state that we're in, right? So we're not living in a state where we have all truth, right? We have some truth, we have a little bit of truth in us, which is the spark of God within us, and we gain more truth when we make choices that are aligned with the truth that we know, right? So we talked a little bit about that in the last chapter. And through our relationship with God, we gain more and more and more truth. Eventually we become truth, which occurs when we're sealed by the Holy Spirit, right? And from there, we continue to gain more truth through our choices. But because we're in between absolute truth and no truth at all, or a complete illusion, which is kind of what this diagram is about, which I'll get to that in a moment. But we're in a state where the truth can be distorted, right? So we're in an in-between state, which, like I said, is pretty much exactly what Socrates says. But to go over this point, which is a consequence of being in this in-between state, negative entities like to distort the truth and convince us that an immoral behavior is righteous. And this is what I call the moral reversal. So this is very important. So I believe I alluded to this idea previously. I forget when. But just to go over it more succinctly and more specifically, we talked about how we can alter our perception, right? So we can hold an intention and alter our perception in such a way that we can perceive morality. So I can use the term subconscious form, or a subconscious form associated with morality, but I believe we went over that so much already. I'll just kind of make things a little bit more smoother and I'll use less technical jargon. But we talked about how it's possible to perceive morality in an immoral behavior, right? And likewise, you can perceive immorality in a moral behavior, right? Like when you forgive someone who has wronged you, that can feel immoral to a certain degree. But spiritual energy is so sensitive that you will always feel a sense of goodness when you forgive someone, even if you think you're wrong for doing so. By the same token, spiritual energy is so sensitive that you will still feel negative when you engage in an immoral behavior, even if you think you're right for doing so, right? Like when you steal from someone or you lie to get out of trouble, you will always feel a little bad about it. Well, negative entities kind of use that whole process to sort of distort what we think of as true, and they will use something that we believe to be true or something we think of as righteous, and they'll use that against us to cause us to engage in an immoral behavior. So what's a good example of that? Well, the one, I think I mentioned it in the book, and one that kind of stood out to me was, and I live in New York State, so there was a mass shooting, I think a few years back. Like I said, I've been coming up with these ideas for years, but a good example of that is there was a mass shooter who was racist, super racist, shot a lot of black people. I think it was in a supermarket. And if I'm not mistaken, I could be confusing some of them, right? There were a couple of them like that, but I believe in his manifesto, he was talking about how there was he was basically expressing a lot of grievances, right, toward the white race, and how multiculturalism or something like that has been very bad for white people, and he was expressing this kind of grievance of oppression and things like that. So I know what goes on in the subconscious mind, right? I know how these things work. Or at least I believe I do, right? So what's going on in the mind of a person like that, and by the way, I 100% believe that person had negative entities planting suggestions in that person's subconscious mind, right? But what's going on subconsciously as this is occurring? In his mind, right, he's thinking he has to save people, right? He has to save the white race, right? He has to save the people who he sees as family or he perceives himself to be closer to than others, right? He perceives himself as having some type of, I don't know if loyalty is quite the right word, but he has some sort of almost responsibility toward these people who he perceives to be part of his family to some degree, right? Now, in the process of feeling this sense of responsibility to save others and protect them, that's a good thing, right? That is an expression of truth, right? So that's good. However, right, because you're not expressing the full truth or the whole truth, you're only expressing a piece of it, I can use that little piece that you have and then take the part of it that's an illusion, right? So if you take the whole idea, protecting the white race, or this person's feeling of his responsibility to protect the white race, right? Some of that contains truth because it's good to protect people, and some of that idea contains the illusion, right? Which is the illusion that you have more of a connection to these people than other people, at least as it relates to the truth of God, right? In the truth of God, we're all one. We're really all one in the Spirit of Jesus Christ. That's what I believe, right? And we have no more responsibility to any one race than any other, right? We're all responsible for each other as a planet, right? And we all sort of help to help society obtain the highest level of truth, which is everyone having a relationship with Jesus, right? That's the more metaphysical answer to that whole idea. But if I don't have that whole truth, if I only have a piece of it, you can use the part of it that's an illusion to get me to believe that I can behave in an immoral way in response to that, the piece of the truth that feels like it's right? So truth our spirit resonates with truth. So negative entities, they like to give us half-truths so that when our spirit will still resonate with a half-truth as long as part of it contains truth, right? So in a Christian community, right, there's often a saying, which I don't think it came from the Christian community. I don't really know exactly where it came from, but it's often in the Christian community, you'll hear the saying that a half-truth is a whole lie. But the half-truth is very, very dangerous. It's more believable than a whole lie, right? And you can get people to do very evil things or very negative things and behave in negative ways if you give them half of a truth. If you give them a whole lie, then it's too obvious, right? They'll just say you're lying, right? And they don't take you seriously. If you give them half a truth, their spirit resonates, and then you can sort of reel them in. And so for this guy, he believes in the half-truth of protecting people. The lie is that he has to protect only these specific groups of people, or a specific group of people, and then also part of that lie, which you can sort of extract more of a lie out of from that illusion, you could say that this is what I fundamentally believe the negative entities put in this guy's mind. They were saying, well, look, these are your people, right? Those other people are not your people, which is a lie, right? But they would plant a suggestion that says these other people are not your people. They are taking advantage, right? So now comes the immorality, right? Other people taking advantage of other people. That's wrong, right? So now what this person wants, they're planting a suggestion in this guy's mind that says you should get justice. Justice is good. Justice is another expression of truth. But he's distorting the facts in the situation such that this form of revenge, basically, it's probably another word, it's probably a better word to describe it. For the moment, I'll just say revenge. That this form of revenge is actually justice, right? So that's a distortion. And so I'm going to get revenge, and I'm going to sacrifice myself. So I'm engaged in self-sacrificing behavior, which self-sacrificing behavior is an expression of truth, right? It's good to sacrifice your ego for the sake of God and for the sake of Jesus Christ, right? We talked about that in the spiritual trade-off effect. But they're saying you want to sacrifice yourself, right, to protect others. And the way you do that is by killing other people, right? So that's absolutely not an expression of truth. There was some truth contained in that idea, but then there were aspects of it that were absolutely antithetical to the nature of truth. By the way, that's where our spiritual... Now, we don't have... Before I even say what I was about to say, we don't have all truth in us. We have a piece of it. We have truth in the form of knowledge, which is basically right and wrong. That comes from the grace that God gives us. And we obtain more truth through our choices in our relationship with God and Jesus Christ, right? But because we don't have all truth as we are, we just have a piece of it, we can get confused, right? And so negative entities love to use that confusion. They will take advantage of the piece of truth that we have, and they'll create an illusion where we think, because we don't know what truth is, we think that some other behaviors are also an expression of truth, or their righteousness, right? Now, our spiritual energy protects us because it's so sensitive that it will always tell us when we're not engaging with the truth, right? So when he engaged in those behaviors, those feelings of hate toward black people and other races, and when he engaged in these feelings and these beliefs or these desires to harm others for the sake of other people, his spiritual energy would have receded, it would have dropped. He would have felt that this is wrong, right? So your spiritual energy protects you from the absence of truth. It's a fail-safe. It's the way God set things up, so you would always know when you're getting closer to the truth, right? Which you do, like I said, through your relationship with God. However, if people don't have the truth, or they don't have these, if they don't recognize these things on a conscious level, and they're ignoring that feeling of something being wrong in their heart, right? The negative entity can take advantage of that. So that's how it works. They plant the suggestion that says, if you kill these people, you're actually engaging in justice, right? If you hurt these people, even though you'll go down for it, you're sacrificing yourself for the sake of others. That's a good thing, right? So that is ultimately the moral reversal, right? They're reversing his sense of morality and using it against him to get him to do something evil. Because people aren't like negative entities, right? Negative entities don't have any spiritual energy in them. They're cut off. They don't need an excuse or some reason to do something evil. They like doing evil. It makes them, I don't know if they can feel happiness or joy, but the closest thing they can get to it is engaging in evil. People are different, right? We still have a connection to God. So we have spiritual energy, we have spiritual drive, and we have a piece of truth in us. Not all truth, but we have a piece of truth. And the only way you can really get a person to do something evil, you can even get them to do evil things like a negative entity, right? But the only way you can really get that to happen initially is by using their own sense of morality against them. The sort of partial truth they have within them, you can use that to say, you know, this evil act you're going to do is actually for a good cause. So really the whole thing is good then, right? As long as your cause is good, right, then all of it is good. And when a person believes that, if you plant suggestions in them and you keep sort of planting those suggestions and you groom their behavior, we'll talk more about spiritual attacks later because that happens with spiritual attacks. If you keep doing it and they keep going along with those suggestions, right, they are still ignoring their spiritual energy, so they do have a lot of culpability and responsibility for their actions and what they're choosing to do. However, that is basically how they do it, and that's how they get people to go against their spiritual drive and engage in evil behavior. So I thought that was a kind of interesting thing, because when I was first coming up with these ideas, I kind of wanted to understand evil, and I was trying to put together basically how negative entities impact us and things like that, coming up with a theory. And this is kind of an interesting framework. This is an interesting ideological framework that I like to think of in terms of the way negative entities impact us, and in terms of what causes us to engage in evil, right? By the way, same thing can happen if you're let's say there's someone that's very jealous of someone, right? It could be like, well, this person has all of this stuff that I don't have. Why do they deserve it over me, right? Aren't we equal? Shouldn't I have what they have, right? And you can use a million different type of explanations or justifications. You can present a million different justifications for it, right? But in the end, it's going to boil down to I should have what this person has, if not more, right? And you'll come up with a million reasons what makes you so special as to why that should be the case. And you might see it as a form of justice, right? There's no reason this person should have more than me, so it should be justice if they have less, right? So now now it looks like a good thing to take away what they have, right? And so you may engage in the evil or immoral behavior if you're very jealous and very envious, and you're charging at that negative emotional frequency. The negative entity, a demon of envy, could plant suggestions. They can latch onto you, first of all, in your subconscious, and they'll plant suggestions into your mind. As you grow more and more envious, right, you may start to engage in more negative or sinful behaviors, and eventually you might hurt someone or steal from them or whatever, because you want to take from them to make things more even, right? There's the moral reversal, using your sense of justice against you. Same thing with revenge. We talked about some of these ideas. You may want to get revenge on someone. Now, what does God call you to do? He calls you to forgive people, right? Forgive everyone. Like I said, it doesn't matter what they do to you. I remember actually something I forgot to talk about before, is there was this racist mass shooter. I forgot was it Georgia? I forget the state, but there was a racist, I think it was Dylan Roof, if I'm not mistaken, wherever that occurred. I think he shot up a church, right? And the people in the church, they did something that some people thought was kind of strange, right? They said that they forgave him, right, for what he did, for killing people in the church. And some people thought that was really strange, like, oh, I'm not forgiving him. Like, no. You know why they forgave him? Because they actually have a relationship with Jesus, right? So even in that situation, you still forgive someone, because they know, like I said, nothing I'm saying is foreign to born again Christians. They've gone through all this, right? They've gone through the spiritual work, and they've gone through the effort of attaining more truth through their relationship with Jesus. So they know how it works. They know the challenge of life is to make decisions that express behavior that matches the nature of Jesus Christ, right? Which the nature of Jesus Christ would always be to forgive, right? There's nothing a person can do to you, even if they shoot up a church, even if they kill people. There's nothing, even if it's people close to you, even if they hurt you, right? There's nothing a person can do that makes them unforgivable, right? You always forgive them. So what these people did in the church is they like, oh, this is an opportunity for me to try to behave like Jesus. Is it hard? Of course it's hard, right? That's the purpose of life. That's why we're here, right? That's the whole point, right? To trade some of your... I don't think I was saying it quite right before, but you understand what I meant. What I was meaning to say is trade comfort when it comes to spiritual trade-off effect. Trade some of your comfort for some spiritual energy. So you give up some of your comfort. So you're a little uncomfortable now because you gave it up, but you got some spiritual energy in return. That's how it works, right? So of course it's uncomfortable. Of course they don't want to forgive this person that hurt them, right? They'd like to see them, the judge throw the book at them. But, which they can still want that, but what I mean is to say that they don't want revenge, right? In their heart, they know that God would still want them to forgive this person and show them grace, even then. And so they're like, well, what would Jesus want? What would God want? I'm going to do what they would want. So as hard as it is for me, I'm going to still forgive this person. They recognize that's the challenge. And so they use this opportunity to take on the challenge and try to behave like Jesus. It's hard, right? Of course it's hard to forgive someone like that, but they're giving it their best effort to do it. That's what God, I believe that's what God wants us all to do. Like I said, that's the whole point of life. So I just thought that was important enough to mention. I might as well mention it here since I forgot to mention it before. But yeah, forgive. There's nothing a person can do that makes them unforgivable. You forgive everybody. That's how God would want you to behave. But let's say that you are a person who wants revenge, right? You may say, no, this person harmed me. I want justice. It's fine to want justice, right? Even if you forgive a person, you can still want justice, some degree of justice in society, right? That's not immoral. Spiritual energy doesn't get pushed away at the idea of wanting justice. However, you can make revenge look like justice and say that you want to now hurt this person. So spiritual energy doesn't say to do that. It doesn't say to put revenge into your own hands, basically, right? And so a person can engage in a negative entity can cause a person to engage in the phenomena of moral reversal, right? I don't know if I said that right, but I think you get what I'm saying. They can use the phenomena of moral reversal against them, right? So they can make a person wanting justice, wanting justice, they can make revenge look like justice and cause that person to engage in immoral behaviors, which would be hurting people. Could also be stealing from, let's say a company fired you or something, you can steal from the company and hurt them. So ultimately, it always comes down to the moral reversal. You can use a person's desire for goodness against them and cause them to engage in evil, right? And that happens because they don't have all truth in them. They would gain more and more truth, so that doesn't happen the closer they go to God, right? The closer they go to Jesus. But if you're giving into suggestions by a negative entity, you're obviously going away from Jesus, and that's what makes you more susceptible to these ideas. What I want to now talk about here is something that I have noticed, and that's basically what I would call the philosophy, the general idea of Satanism, right? And how it can take on different forms, right? Rather than the most obvious form. And it takes on different forms in society, and people will sort of engage with these philosophies or kind of follow them, and it leads to all these negative outcomes because it's really just it's really Satanism just disguised in a different form, right? That's really all it is. And to go over this, the philosophy of evil is fundamentally selfishness, right? Or worship of the self. And this is often masked by an ideology that promotes freedom or liberation, right? So basically what I'm getting at there is evil itself. So what really makes a person evil? How is a person able to even engage in evil actions? When we have spiritual drive, when God is always working in our life, right? Calling us to him, right? We have a higher self, which drives us toward God. We have angels and guides who try to help us find God, right? We have spiritual energy. We have God's grace. We're not like negative entities which are cut off from God, right? Why? How can people truly engage in evil, right? Where does evil come from? Which I kind of went over here, but to talk about it more in terms of an ideology, evil itself fundamentally it's not just selfishness, it's a little more than that. It's the worship of the self. So what does that mean? Well, ultimately what it comes down to is this guy. So that's kind of what this diagram is about. It's a very simple diagram, but it's a diagram nonetheless. Ultimately what it comes down to is the highest expression of, how do I want to word it? The highest expression, the highest sort of manifestation of reality, maybe that's the best way of wording it. The highest existence, you could say, right, is the state where you have all truth, which is God, right? That's where everything's good, everything's wonderful, nothing goes wrong, and there is no sin. The lowest expression of reality, of course, is the absence of truth. It's having no truth in you, untruth, the going deeper into the illusion, right? The truth is fixed, never changes. That's God's nature. The lack of truth changes all the time, is completely an amorphous floating island because it's not based on anything, right? Selfishness is when you promote yourself, in a sense, to the position of God, right? Which is basically to say that you have all truth, right? And you have all truth, and you can fundamentally sort of act and behave from the perspective that all truth belongs to you. And also within that, you generally will sort of focus on, you will sort of almost have this idea that it's almost like no one else exists. That's if you go deepest into the truth. Now, most people don't do that. But if you go deeper into this idea that you have all truth, right, or that you are truth, it becomes very easy to sort of ignore others, right? It's almost like they don't exist. So I should really say this is like an expression of the idea of selfishness. But ultimately, it basically becomes as if these people don't exist, right? Their sort of wants, their needs, things like that, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't exist, right? Truth only belongs to you and your experience of reality, right? So it gets easy to sort of ignore the wants of others, and if they're harmed by their actions, who cares? As long as you have sort of experienced some higher form of reality in your opinion or from your perspective, right? So that is ultimately the philosophy of evil, right? It is very easy for me to harm animals, right? Let's say I want to eat meat, right? I want to eat food, which I'm not saying eating meat is sinful. I'm just saying, right? If I want that, it's very easy for me to kill an animal to get that, right? I don't care, right? If I want what someone else has, it's very easy for me to steal from them because I'm not considering what they want. They have to be real to some degree for me to do that, right? It's much easier for me to do that if I pretend that they don't exist, right? And so on and so forth. So we kind of talked about that in the section on morality, right? Where a person kind of distorts the context of their intention to express a particular context, right? And they distort it so it doesn't fit a particular subconscious form, and that makes them feel less bad when they engage in that behavior or when they produce an intention that expresses that context. So like I said, I don't want to get too technical because we really talked about a lot of that before already, but suffice it to say, it gets easier if you distort the context to not feel bad because of the sensitivity of spiritual energy. Well, that whole ideology, that the process of doing that can sort of expand itself into a whole ideology. And that basically is what evil is. So evil comes from promoting the self to the position of God, which is used to say you have all truth, right? Now, the reason that, and when people do that, I should say when people do that, it usually expresses itself. So people don't, to be fair, people don't go all the way here, right? They don't go all the way with evil in the sense of saying that they completely promote themselves to God and they think they're God and they have all truth. They usually stay somewhere in the middle, but you can get closer to this state of complete untruth, which is a state of pure evil. When this is being in this state at the bottom is when you think of yourself as God, right? To get to truth here is when you draw nearer to God. You recognize you don't have all truth, so you have a piece of truth, right? And you recognize that you are sinful, you've done things that are wrong before, right? And you want forgiveness, so that's part of repentance and asking for forgiveness from God. And then as you recognize this based on the truth you have, that you're imperfect, but you want more truth in you, you want to be better. And so you draw nearer to God, and so you draw nearer to the oneness of God, which is never changing, right? So that's what happens when you draw nearer to God and you want more truth. When you want less truth, or you get confused, right, and this truth is distorted for you, you might go deeper into the absence of truth, in which case it's easier for you to engage in evil, and ultimately in some way you become more selfish. So that's kind of my idea. That's kind of how I set it up. Like I said, I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. It won't be the last. But another consequence of this, the way this sort of ideology manifests itself in society and in culture, is it almost always says that this philosophy, the philosophy of selfishness, it always sort of masks it has some feeling or some behavior that's really a form of freedom or liberation, right? I'm not bound by something. And to be free is a good thing, right? It is a quality of God to be free, right? It is when you feel less free or more confined, right, that's not a quality of God. You're going further away from God if you feel that way. And so the philosophy of evil fundamentally masks itself as freedom or liberation. So it puts like this little pretense or cover on it to say this is a good thing. And that's how it convinces people to follow it despite the negative outcomes. So in Satanism, right, Satanism is actually a philosophy, right? So there are different types of Satanism. Satanism fundamentally is just witchcraft. They pretend like they're atheists. They're not, right? You 100% believe in negative deities. You may not call it Satan, but you believe in Satan. Like I have very little. What's the word I'm looking for? I have little sort of I forgot the word. Tolerance, in a sense, for the pretense that a lot of these people engage in. Same thing with atheists. Like, it just kind of annoys me when they use all these terms that, to kind of make their ideas seem like they're not what they actually are, right? Satanism is very the same way. Oh, we don't really believe in God. We're like, whatever. Like, you know what I mean? I just get kind of annoyed by that. Like, you guys, it doesn't matter what you try to call it, right? They think they legitimize their ideas by using different names and defining things in different ways on a conscious level. Like, you believe in you believe in Satan regardless of what you call it, and you follow him, right? But anyway, Satanism fundamentally, as a philosophy, is about hedonism, right? So it's about worship of the self and engaging in basically indulging yourself, right? No matter how sinful it is, no matter how sinful and wrong it feels, it's about doing it as much as you want to, right? And just focusing purely on self-pleasure and self-gratification. Not in terms of a positive pleasure, in terms of negative pleasures, right? Basically not engaging with self-discipline or concerning yourself with others, just focusing on yourself and what feels good to you, and who cares about others and who cares about what's in your heart telling you this is wrong. So that's fundamentally the philosophy of Satanism, right? And basically when you think that way, there are many negative things you can do because you don't care about your spiritual energy. You don't care about whether things feel right or wrong, and you're just going to do everything you can to have these sort of hedonistic, intensely gratifying, physically gratifying. So they don't really gratify the spirit, but they gratify the body, right? Which generally just means it's a form of negative pleasure, and you want as much of it as you possibly can get, right? So what I want to talk about now is the different ways which this idea kind of manifests itself. Because this is something that I see in society, right? Like I keep saying, the world looks very different to me than it does to a lot of other people. And this is another thing that I see. I see the way Satanism sort of manifests itself in different philosophies in society and in different aspects of culture. And it tries to call itself good, right? People will look at these ideologies and say, no, it's good, usually for something having to do with freedom and liberation, right? We're liberating ourselves. We're free by behaving this way. Even though what you're really doing is rejecting the truth of God. You're going against the truth of God, and you're going more into the absence of truth, but you're going more into the truth that you think the self has, and you're sort of putting it above all, right? And because of that, you're engaging in behaviors that lead to negative outcomes, which Satanism always does. That's the whole point. So what are the kind of ideologies where this occurs? Well, we talked about a little bit about this before, but I'll just kind of go over it again. One of them, like I said before, is feminism, right? So there are different versions of feminism. There is a positive version of feminism, which is fine, right? So that's about women's rights. Women should have rights, and they should really have equal rights in society to men, right? They should have the ability to vote. They should feel safe, right, in the work environment and things like that. And there are different aspects of feminism, but I 100% agree with the positive version of it, right? The positive version is holy. I guarantee you in heaven, men do not have more rights than women or more privileges than women do, right? But then there's also a negative version of it, right? So the negative version of it is ultimately an expression of Satanism or expression of evil, right? Now that might sound a little strange, right? So where does this come from? Well, when I mention this, I'm sure the person watching, you could probably come up with many different ideas. But the one I'm specifically talking about, which kind of made me think to put this in the video, is something I saw the other day. And we're actually going to revisit this again when I talk about spiritual attacks, because there's something God showed me, which was very interesting, right? So he showed me something, the way things look from the spirit realm when some things are occurring, which really opened my eyes. But I'm going to talk about that later. But just talking about this now, I was reading this article, right? So I actually saw this video first, which talked about how a lot of modern moms are failing their daughters, right? And it was talking about how, I forgot her name, Denise Richards. I think she's married to Martin Sheen or Charlie Sheen, one of them. It was saying how she lets her daughter, not only did she encourage her daughter to go into OnlyFans, she actually joined her, right? Which is amazing, right? Or she made videos after her, right? And I'm like, in what she said, which was unbelievable, right? So I saw that, and then I looked up an article about it. I think I went to see if it was actually true. In the video, it was saying how she encouraged her to do it, OnlyFans, and then it said that that this was a form of sexual liberation. Like, you gotta be kidding me, right? But yeah, she said it was a form of sexual liberation, a form of freedom, for a freedom of self-expression or something in her sexuality or some crap like that, right? And then she ends up doing it herself because she wants to be sexually liberated, which is what I'm talking about here, right? Now notice what they're doing there. Notice the ideology, right? This is really what I talked about in the topic of self-righteousness. Self-righteousness always allows a little bit of sin, right? Which it defines what counts as a little bit of sin, but it always allows sin, right? Because that feels the most comfortable, right? It fundamentally rejects the standard of goodness that God has because it's too much, right? So self-righteousness wants a standard set of behaviors where it basically makes sin okay, right? But people still want to be called good, so they allow a little bit of sin, and they do it in such a way where society still calls me good, so I'm okay, right? That's the same as rejecting the goodness of God, which I talked about before. But just basically putting these ideas in a different way, which is in this philosophy, like I said, notice what she's doing. Notice that when she engages in OnlyFans, so now the kid, her daughter is a kid, right? But the world is still new to her. She hasn't gained a lot of experiences. She doesn't know a lot about spiritual energy, the way the spirit responds to these things, which she'll learn, but the outcomes of these things, how damaging they are, how much you feel emptiness from them. The mom should know that, right? That's why kids have role models. Of course the mom is supposed to be telling her this, right? I don't know how the dad feels. I'm sure he hates it, right? But notice that the mom is okay with it. And why? Because fundamentally, what she's doing is she is engaging in behaviors that drop her spiritual energy. So every time it's not like it only feels wrong sometimes. Every single time she does it, it feels wrong, right? She's just gotten comfortable with it. She doesn't care that it feels wrong anymore because society calls her a good person still, right? Which is what matters. It doesn't matter what God says to her, right? Because in her heart, she feels this is wrong. That's a reflection or extension of God's voice. But she doesn't mind that, right? She wants society to see her as good, right? So she says, because society still sees her as a good person, right? She can keep engaging these behaviors even if they feel wrong in their heart, right? And the people who are watching these videos from her and her daughter, right? Now they're engaging in behaviors that not only cause them to be weaker against things that tempt them, which pushes them from God, but it also causes them to engage in sinful behavior that damages their own spirit. It damages it causes God's spirit to sort of recede from that person's life. I'm trying not to use terminology that I'm going to talk about in chapter 10, because would be the more accurate way to describe it. But I'll just say that it causes God's spirit not to move in that person's life as much. If God's spirit is not moving in that person's life, then that person's life is going to go south, right? It's going to be very bad. A whole bunch of bad things will just start coming in their life. They'll be depressed, and their relationships will get damaged, and they'll lose a lot of things in their life that are good. By the way, yes, that can happen just from watching adult content like that, right? Well, again, we'll talk more about that in chapter 10. And so their life is becoming damaged. They're becoming depressed. Their relationship with God is becoming strained, right? Any longer they stay in, and not only that, negative entities can now latch onto them and make it worse, and it can spread further in reality because of that, right? Now, notice how she doesn't care about that. She doesn't care about sort of feeding these guys addictions and them destroying their life and weakening their ability to accomplish great things, because porn addiction completely destroys your ability to use your subconscious in a manifestational kind of way. Again, we'll talk about that later. For the moment, we'll just say it messes up your ability to accomplish great things, right? Completely damages your ability. And that'll affect other people. It'll affect your relationships. It'll affect other things you could have done, ways you could have made society better, all types of things. But notice she doesn't care about a lot of that. I don't even know if they've taken the moment to even think about it, right? It doesn't matter to them how much they're destroying society or how much they're profiting off its destruction, as long as they got theirs, right? They got their money and they got it easily. They didn't actually have to put in some actual work to get some money and do good things, right? Now, you might say Denise Richards, well, she was an actor, she did work in the past. I mean, I don't know what her financial situation is now, but that's mostly irrelevant, right? If you wanted money now, then you'd have to put in work, right? Now, notice what she said that she's saying. She doesn't care about any of that, right? I don't care how much other people get damaged. I'm going to do this, even if it feels wrong, so that my life is easier, right? Once again, we talked about how life is an exam. That's 100% failing the exam, because you're just engaging in selfishness. But more specifically to this video, the negativity and the evil behavior that she's engaging in, which is based on selfishness, destroying other people's lives, just so your life can be made easier. Notice how the ideology is masked in a sense of freedom or liberation, right? So now it doesn't look as bad because you put this little label on it that makes it seem good, right? Fundamentally, that's still an expression of Satanism. That's still a consequence of it, which, as you can see, OnlyFans and porn addiction has fundamentally destroyed certain aspects of society. Not destroyed them, that's kind of an exaggeration, but I think you get what I'm saying, right? It has made people's lives very, very difficult. Men's lives difficult because of porn addiction, right? They are not able to become a more full version of themselves. And you can see the damage across society. By the way, it also damages women, right? Because when women engage in these behaviors, they also lose spiritual energy. God's spirit also recedes from their life. It means nothing that they gain more money. They're fundamentally still unhappy, and they're not able to impact society in a way that causes more truth to exist and spread out through society, which is what the Holy Spirit does, right? And so, like I said before, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So that's the saying, right? Power never really makes people happy. They're always unhappy when they get more power, because the real key to happiness is to come closer to God, and you do that largely through the spiritual trade-off effect that we talked about, which means trading your comfort for spiritual energy. In other words, putting yourself in difficult circumstances that require you to try to sort of sacrifice your ego, right? And reduce your ego and reduce the things that the ego wants in service of God and in service of Jesus. You're focused on what Jesus wants instead of what your ego wants. That's hard. That's tricky to do, and it's challenging, but it's fulfilling, right? When you do it. And when you dedicate your life to that, you feel the most fulfillment. And that's what born-again Christians do. But if you're not doing that, if you just have power and you keep trying to rely on that power to make life easy and try to find happiness, you're never going to find it. That's why a lot of women are very unhappy, right, today, even though they have more power than ever through sexuality, right? But anyway, what I was going to say is ultimately you can see how this kind of satanic idea, the philosophy of Satanism, sort of creeps in to this idea of feminism, the negative version of feminism, and it has a lot of negative consequences, right? So that's something I thought was interesting enough to mention. When I saw that video and I read the article, I'm like, see, that's what I'm talking about, right? So like that kind of happens to me all the time, where I just see things like that, and I'm like, and I just compare it to these ideas and this theory. In the next video, we're going to talk about drugs and alcohol and how negative entities are involved in those situations. In the book, I talk about in terms of illicit sex too, but we kind of already covered that idea. So probably most of it will just be about drugs and alcohol. So yeah, that's it for now though, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.